When Vanessa Montgomery was 12 years old, her father taught her that power isn't about the money you have, it's about the enemies you make along the way. She never understood what he meant until the morning she woke up in a shipping container somewhere in international waters, listening to her captors discuss which airports to hit first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last thing Vanessa Montgomery remembered from her normal life was the taste of her morning coffee, Ethiopian blend, black, no sugar, as she reviewed quarterly reports in her corner office at Montgomery Industries. At 28, she served as vice president of operations for her father's empire, a position she'd earned through relentless work ethic rather than nepotism, though the media never saw it that way. Marcus Montgomery had built his fortune from nothing, transforming a small logistics company into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that controlled shipping routes across 3 continents. What the public didn't know was how many enemies he'd accumulated during his rise to power. What Vanessa was about to learn was how far those enemies were willing to go. The abduction happened on a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. Vanessa had just finished a breakfast meeting with potential investors at the Palmer House when her security detail inexplicably vanished. One moment, her bodyguard Thomas Chen was walking beside her toward the black SUV. The next moment, she was being forced into a different vehicle by men wearing maintenance uniforms. The precision of the operation suggested military training. No witnesses, no cameras, no evidence. Her phone had been remotely disabled before she even realized what was happening. The entire kidnapping took less than 90 seconds, executed with surgical precision in broad daylight on one of Chicago's busiest streets. When Vanessa regained consciousness, she found herself in what appeared to be a modified shipping container. The walls were lined with sound-dampening material, and a single LED panel provided harsh white light. Her wrists bore the marks of zip ties, though her captors had removed the restraints once she was secured in the container. A small table held bottles of water and military rations, enough supplies to suggest this wasn't meant to be a quick operation. The container swayed gently, and the distant sound of engines told her she was aboard a ship. Through a small porthole, she could see nothing but the endless ocean. Her captors had planned this carefully, taking her somewhere beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The first person she met was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and cold blue eyes. She introduced herself simply as Colonel Martinez and spoke with the crisp diction of someone accustomed to giving orders that weren't questioned. "Ms. Montgomery," Martinez said, settling into a metal chair across from Vanessa, "I want you to understand that your comfort and safety depend entirely on your father's cooperation. We're not unreasonable people, but we have limited patience." Vanessa had been trained for situations like this. Marcus Montgomery hadn't built his empire without making contingency plans for every possible threat, including the kidnapping of his daughter. She knew to stay calm, gather information, and wait for the extraction team that would inevitably come. "What do you want?" Vanessa asked, keeping her voice steady. "Your father controls shipping routes that have been used to transport certain materials that shouldn't have been transported," Martinez replied. "Materials that ended up in the wrong hands, causing significant problems for the people we represent. He's going to help us solve those problems." The conversation was interrupted by a younger man in military fatigues who entered the container without knocking. He whispered something to Martinez that made her expression harden. "It seems your father is being less cooperative than we anticipated," Martinez said, standing up. "He's mobilized Blackwater contractors and is making threats about shutting down international air traffic. This wasn't part of our original timeline." Vanessa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the container's temperature. Her father had often spoken about the nuclear option, a contingency plan so extreme that he'd never explained the details, only saying it would bring the entire system to its knees if anyone ever targeted his family. "I'm sorry. You don't understand who you're dealing with," Vanessa said quietly. "My father doesn't negotiate with terrorists." Martinez laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Terrorists? Ms. Montgomery, we represent legitimate business interests that your father damaged. We're simply evening the score. But if he wants to escalate this situation, we're prepared for that outcome as well." Over the next several hours, Vanessa began to piece together fragments of information from her captors, conversations. Her father's company had apparently been used to transport weapons to a private military contractor called Crimson Solutions, weapons that were then sold to parties that Martinez's organization considered unacceptable. The kidnapping was meant to be leveraged to force Marcus Montgomery to provide information about Crimson Solutions, operations, and supply chains. What her captors hadn't anticipated was Marcus Montgomery's response. Instead of opening negotiations, he'd activated what Vanessa now realized was a private military force of his own, one that had been quietly assembled over years of planning for exactly this scenario. The first sign that something had changed came when Martinez received a phone call that left her visibly shaken. She spoke in rapid Spanish to several of her subordinates before turning back to Vanessa. "Your father has just grounded every commercial flight on the East Coast," Martinez said. "He's claiming mechanical issues with air traffic control systems. How exactly does a shipping magnate have that kind of power?" Vanessa smiled for the first time since her capture. "You really didn't do your homework, did you? Montgomery Industries doesn't just move cargo. We own the systems that track every piece of freight, every flight plan, every shipping manifest in North America. My father helped design the integration protocols between commercial aviation and freight logistics after 9/11. If he says planes don't fly, planes don't fly." The implications of this revelation were clearly sinking in among her captors. Martinez was already making phone calls, her voice becoming increasingly urgent with each conversation. Whatever plan they'd had was unraveling faster than they could adapt. But Vanessa knew her father well enough to understand that grounding flights was just the beginning. Marcus Montgomery had spent decades building redundancies and fail-safes into every aspect of his business. If someone had taken his daughter, he wouldn't just fight back. He'd dismantle the entire system piece by piece until he got her back. The war had begun, and her captors had no idea what they'd unleashed. Marcus Montgomery hadn't slept in 36 hours, and he had no intention of sleeping until his daughter was home. The command center he'd established in the sub-basement of Montgomery Industries headquarters buzzed with activity as technicians monitored dozens of screens displaying real-time data from across the globe. The room itself was a testament to paranoia turned into preparation. Hidden beneath Chicago's financial district, it had been constructed over the course of 15 years, with enough redundant systems and communication arrays to operate independently of any external infrastructure. Marcus had called it his insurance policy. Today, it would serve as his war room. Status report. Marcus commanded as he entered, his usually immaculate suit replaced by tactical gear that made him look more like a mercenary than a Fortune 500 CEO. Director Sarah Walsh, his head of security operations, looked up from a bank of monitors. "We've successfully disrupted air traffic control systems at 17 major airports. Commercial aviation is essentially paralyzed from Boston to Miami. The FAA is calling it an unprecedented technical failure, but our people are already receiving calls from federal agencies who know better." "Good. What about our friends at Crimson Solutions? Their headquarters in Virginia went dark 2 hours ago. Our cyber division penetrated their systems before they could implement countermeasures. We've extracted personnel files, client lists, and operational data going back 5 years. The information confirms your suspicions about their involvement in the weapons trafficking that led to this situation." Marcus nodded grimly. Crimson Solutions had been using Montgomery Industries shipping networks to transport military hardware to buyers across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. When those weapons ended up in the hands of groups that destabilized regions his business partners considered strategically important, it had created a chain of consequences that ultimately led to his daughter's kidnapping. "Sir," interrupted Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a former Navy SEAL who now headed Marcus's private military unit, "we've located the vessel." The main screen shifted to display satellite imagery of a cargo ship positioned approximately 200 miles southeast of the Bahamas. The vessel, registered under a Panamanian flag as the Maria Isabella, had been moving in slow circles for the past 18 hours, a holding pattern that suggested they were waiting for instructions. "How many hostiles?" Marcus asked. "Thermal imaging suggests 12 to 15 individuals aboard. The ship has been modified with additional communications equipment and what appears to be a reinforced container structure on the main deck. That's likely where they're holding Vanessa." Marcus studied the image intensely. The ship's position was carefully chosen, far enough from any coastline to complicate rescue operations, but close enough to major shipping lanes to blend in with commercial traffic. His daughter's captors were professionals, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed he would follow conventional protocols. "What's the timeline for extraction?" he asked. Morrison consulted his tablet. "We can have a team in position within 4 hours. However, sir, I need to point out that a direct assault on a vessel in international waters will create significant diplomatic complications. The State Department. The State Department, Marcus interrupted, can file their complaints after I have my daughter back. What other options do we have? Walsh cleared her throat. Actually, sir, we might not need a direct assault. Our cyber division has identified a vulnerability in their communications system. If we can disrupt their ability to coordinate, we can force them to make mistakes. She gestured to one of her technicians, who brought up a new display showing communication intercepts from the ship. They're using encrypted satellite phones, but the encryption is commercial grade, not military. We can break it, but more importantly, we can manipulate it. We can make them think they're receiving orders that they're not actually receiving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus considered this. Psychological warfare had always appealed to him more than direct confrontation. It was cleaner, more precise, and often more effective than brute force. What kind of false orders? He asked. We've been monitoring their communications for patterns. The woman in charge, she calls herself Colonel Martinez, has been receiving instructions from someone using the code name Shepard. If we can impersonate a Shepard, we can potentially turn their operation against itself. On another screen, a technician was already demonstrating the concept, showing how voice modulation software could replicate the speech patterns and background noise from previous intercepted calls. There's something else, Morrison added. We've identified Martinez. Her real name is Elena Vasquez, former Colombian military intelligence. She went private about 8 years ago after a scandal involving unauthorized operations in Venezuela. She's been linked to at least 6 kidnappings across South America, all targeting executives from companies involved in resource extraction. So this isn't random, Marcus concluded. Someone specifically hired her because of her experience with corporate targets. Exactly. And if we can identify who's paying her, we can address the root of the problem instead of just treating the symptoms. Marcus moved to the central command station, where multiple screens displayed everything from stock market fluctuations to real-time traffic patterns across major cities. The economic impact of his actions was already becoming visible. Airline stocks were plummeting, cargo shipments were backing up at ports, and federal agencies were scrambling to understand what they were calling the most significant infrastructure disruption since 9/11. Sir, one of the junior analysts called out, we're getting reports of unusual activity at military installations along the East Coast. It appears the Pentagon is mobilizing assets, possibly in response to our operations. This was expected. Marcus had known that shutting down air traffic would eventually trigger a federal response, but he'd calculated that the initial confusion would buy him enough time to resolve the situation privately. Now that window was closing. How long before they trace the disruptions back to us? He asked. 48 hours, maybe less, Walsh replied. Our cover stories will hold for a while, but eventually someone's going to ask the right questions. Marcus made his decision. Initiate Phase 2. I want every airport from Los Angeles to New York experiencing technical difficulties within the next 6 hours. Make it look like a cascading system failure, something that could plausibly be the result of outdated infrastructure and poor maintenance. Sir, that level of disruption will effectively shut down domestic air travel across the entire country, Morrison warned. The economic impact, Marcus said coldly, is the point. Every hour that passes without my daughter's safe return will cost this country billions of dollars in lost productivity. Eventually, someone will decide that resolving one kidnapping is preferable to watching the entire transportation sector collapse. He turned to address the room. I want everyone to understand something. We're not just fighting for Vanessa. We're fighting for the principle that there are consequences for targeting American business leaders and their families. If we allow this to stand, if we negotiate or compromise, we'll be painting targets on the backs of every executive in this country. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. This wasn't just a rescue operation. It was a declaration of war against anyone who thought they could use kidnapping as a business tactic. As technicians began implementing the expanded disruption protocol, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. He'd built his empire by understanding that in business, as in war, perception was often more important than reality. His enemies had taken his daughter because they believed they understood his limitations. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The situation aboard the Maria Isabella was deteriorating rapidly. Elena Vasquez, the woman Vanessa knew as Colonel Martinez, paced the ship's bridge like a caged animal, barking orders in 3 different languages as reports flooded in from contacts across the continental United States. Confirme eso, she snapped into her satellite phone. Every single airport? Vanessa could hear fragments of the conversation from her position near the bridge's entrance, where she'd been moved after convincing her guards she needed medical attention for a fabricated migraine. In reality, she was gathering intelligence, using skills her father had insisted she learned during summers spent at corporate security training facilities. The conversation Elena was having painted a picture of chaos that even Vanessa found hard to believe. According to the reports, her father hadn't just disrupted East Coast aviation, he'd somehow managed to create cascading failures that were spreading across the entire national airspace system. Flights were being grounded from Seattle to Miami, cargo shipments were stranded, and the economic losses were mounting by the hour. "This is impossible," Elena muttered, switching to English as she ended the call. "One man cannot shut down an entire country's air traffic system." "You don't know my father," Vanessa said quietly. Elena whirled around, her hand instinctively moving to the pistol at her hip. "You should be resting, Ms. Montgomery." "Hard to rest when you're listening to your entire operation fall apart," Vanessa replied. "Whatever you were paid for this job, it wasn't enough." Before Elena could respond, another phone rang. This time it was the encrypted device she kept for communications with her employer, the person she knew only as Shepard. She answered immediately, her posture straightening into military attention despite the fact that her commander couldn't see her. "Colonel Martinez reporting," she said. But something was wrong with the voice on the other end. It carried the same cadence and vocabulary as previous calls, but there was a subtle difference in the background noise, a digital quality that hadn't been present before. "Colonel, we're accelerating the timeline," the voice said. "The target's father has proven more resourceful than anticipated. We need to move to Phase 3 immediately." "Phase 3? Elena's voice carried a note of confusion. "Sir, we never discussed Phase 3. The original plan was to hold the asset for 72 hours maximum." "Plans change, Colonel. Intelligence suggests Montgomery is receiving federal assistance. We need to relocate the asset to the secondary site and eliminate any potential witnesses." Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. Eliminate witnesses could only mean one thing. They wanted her to kill the hostage and dispose of the crew who could identify them. This wasn't part of the original contract. "Sir, respectfully, that represents a significant departure from our agreed parameters." "Are you questioning orders, Colonel?" The voice carried a tone of authority that Elena had been conditioned to obey through years of military service. But something about this conversation felt fundamentally wrong. She made a decision that would save her life and potentially change the entire outcome of the operation. "I need to verify this order through secondary channels," she said, "standard protocol for major tactical shifts." She ended the call and immediately began attempting to contact Shepard through alternative communication methods. What she discovered over the next 30 minutes would force her to completely reevaluate everything she thought she knew about her employer and the true nature of their mission. Meanwhile, Vanessa was using her apparent medical emergency to explore more of the ship. Her guards, distracted by the chaos surrounding Elena's command decisions, had become increasingly lax in their supervision. She'd managed to identify several critical pieces of information: the ship's exact position based on navigation equipment she'd glimpsed, the number and positioning of her captors, and most importantly, the location of the ship's emergency communication system. The Maria Isabella had been modified extensively, but it was still a commercial cargo vessel at its core. That meant it was required to carry emergency communication equipment that operated independently of the systems her captors were using. If she could reach that equipment, she could potentially contact her father directly. The opportunity came when Elena's investigation into the suspicious orders created a heated argument among the crew. Voices were raised on the bridge as Elena confronted her second-in-command about protocols and authorization codes. In the confusion, Vanessa slipped away from her guard and made her way toward the ship's emergency station. The emergency radio was located in a small compartment near the engine room, protected by a simple lock that Vanessa managed to break using a maintenance tool she'd retrieved from a supply cabinet. Her hands shook as she activated the equipment, and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency her father had taught her years earlier. Mayday, Mayday, this is Vanessa Montgomery, aboard the vessel Maria Isabella, approximately 200 miles southeast of Nassau. I am being held against my will by armed individuals. GPS coordinates are... She rattled off the numbers she'd memorized from the bridge navigation system. But her transmission was interrupted by footsteps in the corridor outside. She quickly shut down the radio and hid the evidence of her communication attempt, but not before she heard the faint crackle of a response that sounded distinctly like her father's voice. The footsteps passed without stopping, but Vanessa knew her window for independent action was closing. Elena's crew was becoming increasingly paranoid as their operation unraveled, and any further attempts at escape or communication would likely result in stricter confinement or worse. Back on the bridge, Elena was reaching her own conclusions about the situation. Her attempts to verify the suspicious orders had revealed something disturbing. Shepard appeared to be communicating through compromised channels. Either her employer had been captured or replaced, or someone was actively manipulating their communications. The implications were staggering. If someone had penetrated their operational security to the extent that they could impersonate command authority, then everything about this mission was suspect. Elena began to wonder if they'd been manipulated from the very beginning, if the entire kidnapping had been designed not to extract concessions from Marcus Montgomery, but to trigger exactly the kind of response they were now witnessing. Her satellite phone rang again, displaying Shepard's identifier. This time, Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she activated recording equipment and prepared to analyze every detail of the conversation. "Colonel Martinez," the voice said when she finally picked up. "Why didn't you acknowledge the previous transmission?" "Technical difficulties," Elena replied carefully. "Please repeat the orders for Phase 3. As the voice began to outline instructions for relocating Vanessa and eliminating potential witnesses, Elena's suspicions crystallized into certainty. The speech patterns were too perfect, the background noise too clean, and most tellingly, the voice used tactical terminology that the real Shepard had never employed in previous communications. Someone was playing a very sophisticated game of deception, and Elena was beginning to understand that both she and her crew were pawns in a larger strategy that none of them had been told about. The question now was whether they could extract themselves from the situation before it escalated beyond the point of no return. The war between Marcus Montgomery and his daughter's kidnappers had evolved into something far more complex than a simple rescue operation. It had become a test of wills, resources, and strategic thinking that would determine not just Vanessa's fate, but the future balance of power between private enterprise and the forces that sought to challenge it. The Pentagon's Situation Room had been converted into a crisis management center within hours of the first airport shutdowns. General Patricia Hayes, Joint Chiefs of Staff, stared at the wall of monitors displaying a real-time map of grounded aircraft across North America. Red dots marked every disabled airport, creating a pattern that looked disturbingly like a coordinated military strike. "This isn't terrorism," she announced to the assembled intelligence officials. "This is corporate warfare." FBI Director Michael Chen leaned forward in his chair. "Our cyber division confirms the disruptions originated from multiple sources, but they all trace back to infrastructure systems that Montgomery Industries helped design and implement. We're looking at the systematic exploitation of backdoors that were built into our transportation network." "Legal backdoors or illegal ones?" asked CIA Deputy Director Amanda Foster. "That's the problem," Chen replied. "Montgomery Industries was contracted to integrate freight tracking with aviation systems after 9/11. Everything they did was authorized, documented, and approved by multiple federal agencies. They didn't hack anything. They're using access they were officially granted." General Hayes absorbed this information with growing unease. The military had contingency plans for terrorist attacks, foreign interference, and natural disasters, but they'd never prepared for the possibility that a private citizen could single-handedly paralyze national transportation infrastructure using legally obtained access. "What's Montgomery's demand?" she asked. "That's just it," Foster replied. "He hasn't made any demands. No communication with federal agencies, no ransom requests, no political statements. He's simply destroying the economy piece by piece until something changes." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Traditional crisis management relied on negotiation, but you couldn't negotiate with someone who refused to communicate. Montgomery had effectively declared war on the entire system, without stating his terms for peace. "Sir," interrupted Lieutenant Colonel David Park from his position at the communications station, "we've intercepted emergency radio traffic that might be relevant." The main screen shifted to display a spectrogram of radio signals. "We picked up a distress call on maritime emergency frequencies about 40 minutes ago." The voice identified herself as Vanessa Montgomery and provided GPS coordinates for a vessel in international waters. General Hayes felt the pieces clicking into place. So this isn't about corporate disputes or political revenge. Someone kidnapped his daughter, and he's willing to bring down the entire country to get her back. "It appears so," Chen confirmed. "We've identified the vessel, a cargo ship called the Maria Isabella. Satellite surveillance confirms armed individuals aboard and unusual modifications consistent with a kidnapping operation." "Who's behind the kidnapping?" "Still working on that, but we've identified the leader as Elena Vasquez, formerly of Colombian Military Intelligence. She operates a private security firm that specializes in corporate extractions and asset recovery." General Hayes studied the satellite imagery of the ship. "Options? We could deploy Navy SEALs for a hostage rescue," Colonel Park suggested. "But the vessel is in international waters, which creates jurisdictional complications." "More importantly," Foster added, "any overt military action could escalate Montgomery's response. Right now, he's targeting transportation infrastructure. If he perceives federal intervention as hostile, there's no telling how he might retaliate." The discussion was interrupted by an aide who rushed into the room carrying a classified briefing folder. "General, you need to see this immediately." Hayes opened the folder and scanned the contents, her expression darkening with each page. "It appears Mr. Montgomery has been planning for this contingency for years. Intelligence suggests he's constructed a private military capability that rivals some small nations." She looked up at the assembled officials. "The question isn't whether we can stop him. It's whether we can afford the consequences of trying." Meanwhile, in the waters southeast of the Bahamas, Elena Vasquez was conducting her own strategic assessment. The discovery that her communications were being manipulated had forced her to reconsider everything about the current operation, and the conclusions she was reaching weren't encouraging. She'd managed to establish secure contact with 2 other members of her organization who were positioned on shore. Their reports confirmed her worst fears. The entire kidnapping had been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both Montgomery's capabilities and her own operational methods. "It's a setup," she told her second-in-command, Carlos Rivera, as they met privately in the ship's converted briefing room. "We were hired to kidnap Montgomery's daughter specifically because someone knew it would trigger this response." "But why?" Carlos asked. "What's the endgame?" Elena had been asking herself the same question. The answer, when it came to her, was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. "Think about it," she said. "Montgomery's response is destroying American transportation infrastructure more effectively than any terrorist attack in history. The economic damage is already in the billions, and it's increasing exponentially every hour. So someone wanted to damage the American economy? Not just damage it. Demonstrate how vulnerable it is. Show that a single private citizen with the right access and resources can bring the entire system to its knees." Elena paused as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. "We're not working for a traditional client. We're working for someone who wants to prove that American infrastructure can be held hostage by private interests." The implications were staggering. If her analysis was correct, they weren't just participants in a kidnapping. They were unwitting actors in a demonstration of economic warfare that could reshape global understanding of American vulnerabilities. Her contemplation was interrupted by urgent knocking on the door. One of her technicians entered, carrying equipment that Elena immediately recognized as signal detection gear. "Colonel, we've got a problem," the technician reported. "Someone's been broadcasting from the ship. Emergency radio, maritime frequencies. The transmission included our GPS coordinates and lasted approximately 3 minutes. Elena felt her blood turn cold. If Vanessa Montgomery had managed to communicate their position to her father, then everything was about to change. Montgomery's resources weren't limited to disrupting airports. He almost certainly had the capability to mount a rescue operation. "When?" she demanded. "Approximately 1 hour ago. The signal was detected by at least 4 monitoring stations, possibly more." Elena made rapid calculations. 1 hour was enough time for Montgomery to position assets for an assault, but not enough time for a full-scale military response. They were in a narrow window where escape was still possible, but only if they acted immediately. "All hands, prepare for emergency departure," she ordered. "We're moving to the secondary location." But as her crew began implementing emergency protocols, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were still dancing to someone else's choreography. Every move they made seemed to play into a larger strategy that none of them could see clearly. The real question wasn't whether they could escape Montgomery's response. It was whether they were meant to escape or whether their capture was simply the next phase of a plan they'd never been told about. As the Maria Isabella's engines roared to life and the vessel began moving toward deeper waters, Elena realized that she was no longer certain who was hunting whom in this increasingly complex game of strategy and deception. Dr. Rachel Kim had never expected her expertise in behavioral psychology to land her in a submarine racing through Caribbean waters at 3 in the morning. As the Montgomery Industries chief crisis negotiator, she'd handled everything from hostile takeovers to industrial espionage. But nothing had prepared her for the scale of resources Marcus Montgomery could deploy when his family was threatened. The submarine Neptune's Shadow was officially listed as a deep-sea research vessel owned by a Montgomery subsidiary. In reality, it was a military-grade attack submarine that had been quietly acquired from a bankrupt Russian shipyard and retrofitted with the latest surveillance and weapons systems. Rachel was beginning to understand that Marcus Montgomery's public persona as a shipping magnate masked something far more dangerous. "Target acquired," announced Commander Lisa Torres from the vessel's tactical station. "Maria Isabella is 7 nautical miles ahead, making course corrections every 20 minutes. They're definitely running, but they don't seem to know we're tracking them." Marcus studied the sonar display with the intensity of a general planning a decisive battle. "Are they still jamming conventional communications?" "Negative," Torres replied. "We're picking up multiple transmissions between the ship and unknown shore-based contacts. Elena Vasquez is coordinating with at least 3 separate entities, and none of them appear to be her original employer." Rachel leaned closer to the communication station. Her psychological profile of Vasquez suggested a professional mercenary who valued control and clear command structures. The fact that she was now dealing with multiple unknown parties indicated the situation had evolved beyond her operational parameters. "She's losing control of the narrative," Rachel observed. Vasquez expected a simple kidnapping with clear demands and negotiations. Instead, she's trapped in a scenario where she doesn't understand the rules or the players. "Good," Marcus said coldly. "Confusion breeds mistakes." But Rachel was concerned about more than tactical advantage. Her analysis of the intercepted communications suggested something troubling about the broader conspiracy behind Vanessa's kidnapping. "Marcus, I need you to consider the possibility that we're playing into someone's hands," she said carefully. "Every action we've taken has created exactly the kind of chaos that could be used to justify expanded federal oversight of private infrastructure control." Marcus turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Explain. Think about it from a policy perspective. For years, there have been concerns about private companies having too much control over critical infrastructure. Your response to Vanessa's kidnapping has demonstrated that a single individual can essentially shut down national transportation systems at will. There are people in Washington who would love to use this crisis as justification for nationalizing infrastructure control." The submarine's communication system crackled to life before Marcus could respond. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from headquarters. Director Walsh needs to speak with you immediately." Marcus activated the secure channel. Sarah Walsh's voice came through with crystal clarity despite the distance and encryption. "Marcus, we've got a problem. The President just signed an emergency executive order placing all critical infrastructure under temporary federal oversight. They're citing your airport disruptions as evidence of private sector security failures." Rachel felt her worst fears being confirmed. "How temporary is temporary?" she asked. "Indefinitely, until a comprehensive security review can be completed. The review process could take years, and there's no guarantee that control would ever be returned to private hands." Marcus was silent for several long moments, processing the implications. His response to his daughter's kidnapping had just provided his political enemies with the perfect justification for seizing control of the empire he'd spent decades building. "Who's pushing the executive order?" he finally asked. "Multiple sources, but the primary advocate is Secretary of Homeland Security Jennifer Park. She's been arguing for infrastructure nationalization for years, and she's using this crisis as her opportunity." The pieces of the conspiracy were becoming clearer. Someone had orchestrated Vanessa's kidnapping specifically to trigger Marcus's response, knowing that his actions would provide the political cover necessary for a federal takeover of private infrastructure. We need to accelerate the rescue timeline, Marcus decided. If we can get Vanessa back before the federal seizure is completed, I can argue that private security was effective and that the disruptions were a temporary emergency measure. Commander Torres looked up from her station. Sir, we've got a complication. Long-range sensors are detecting multiple vessels converging on the Maria Isabella's position. It looks like we're not the only ones tracking them. The main display shifted to show a tactical overview of the area. In addition to their submarine and the kidnappers' ship, at least 4 other vessels were moving toward the same coordinates, 2 showing the electronic signatures of U.S. Navy vessels, one that appeared to be a private military contractor ship and one of unknown origin. It's becoming a convention, Rachel muttered. How many different parties are involved in this operation? Marcus studied the display with growing unease. The complexity of the situation was exceeding even his extensive contingency planning. Commander, what's the status of our extraction team? Insertion Team Alpha is ready for deployment. We can have them aboard the Maria Isabella within 30 minutes, but the presence of other vessels complicates the tactical picture significantly. Rachel was analyzing the positioning of the various ships when a new realization struck her. Marcus, what if the convergence is intentional? What if someone wanted to create a situation where multiple military and private forces would be operating in the same area with conflicting objectives? A controlled confrontation, Marcus said, understanding her implication. Create a situation so chaotic that federal intervention becomes not just justified but necessary. The communication system activated again. This time, it was a transmission from one of the approaching Navy vessels. Unknown submarine, this is Captain Rodriguez of the USS Baltimore. You are operating in waters where we are conducting a federal law enforcement operation. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Marcus looked at Commander Torres. Are we in international waters? Barely. We're right at the edge of the territorial boundary. Rachel could see the trap closing around them. If Marcus identified himself, he'd be admitting to operating a military submarine in waters where the Navy was conducting operations. If he didn't respond, the Navy might treat them as a hostile vessel. Either choice could escalate the situation beyond the point of no return. Unknown submarine, you have 60 seconds to respond before we classify you as a potential threat to federal operations. Marcus made his decision. Commander, prepare the insertion team for immediate deployment. Dr. Kim, I need you to prepare a psychological profile of Elena Vasquez that we can use for rapid negotiation if direct action fails. And the Navy? Torres asked. Let them wonder who we are for another few minutes. Once our people are aboard the Maria Isabella, it won't matter what anyone else thinks about our presence here. But as the submarine special operations team prepared for their mission, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Every move they made seemed to serve someone else's agenda, and she was beginning to wonder if Marcus's formidable resources and strategic thinking were actually being used against him by an adversary who understood his capabilities better than he understood theirs. The rescue operation was about to begin, but Rachel suspected that saving Vanessa was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game. Vanessa Montgomery had spent the last 3 hours methodically studying the structural weaknesses of her modified shipping container prison. Her captors had underestimated her engineering background, a mistake that was about to cost them dearly. While they'd been distracted by the chaos surrounding their deteriorating operation, she'd been quietly preparing for an escape attempt that would exploit fundamental flaws in their security measures. The container's ventilation system was the key. Her captors had installed additional air circulation to prevent suffocation during extended confinement, but the ducting ran through areas of the ship that weren't under constant surveillance. More importantly, the ventilation shafts connected to the engine room, a space that would provide access to critical ship systems. As she worked to loosen the vent cover using a piece of metal she'd torn from her cot frame, Vanessa could hear increasing tension in the voices of her guards outside. Elena Vasquez was clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that had evolved far beyond anyone's original planning. Colonel, we've got multiple radar contacts approaching from different vectors. She heard one of the crew members report. At least 5 vessels, possibly more. Elena's response was sharp with stress. Identification. Two are definitely U.S. Navy. One appears to be a private contractor vessel, registration unknown. The others aren't transmitting identification codes. Vanessa smiled grimly as she continued working on the vent cover. Her father had obviously received her emergency transmission and was responding with characteristic overwhelming force. But the presence of multiple unidentified vessels suggested the situation was more complex than a simple rescue operation. The vent cover finally came free, and Vanessa carefully lowered herself into the narrow ducting system. The metal was hot from engine heat, and sharp edges caught at her clothing, but she forced herself to move quietly through the confined space toward the mechanical areas of the ship. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Maria Isabella, Elena was rapidly losing confidence in her ability to navigate the increasingly dangerous tactical situation. The appearance of multiple military vessels had transformed what should have been a straightforward kidnapping into what looked suspiciously like the opening moves of a naval engagement. Oh. Her encrypted communication device chimed with an incoming message from an unknown sender. The text was brief but chilling. Phase 4 initiated. Maintain position until further orders. Any attempt to deviate will result in immediate termination of contract and personnel. Elena stared at the message with growing horror. Phase 4 hadn't been part of any operational plan she'd been briefed on, and the threatening language suggested her mysterious employers were prepared to eliminate her and her crew if they didn't comply with orders they'd never agreed to follow. She called her second-in-command, Carlos Rivera, to the bridge for a private conference. Carlos, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you trust the people who hired us for this job? Carlos considered the question carefully. No, Colonel. Too many details don't add up. The advance payment was too large, the target selection was too specific, and the operational parameters keep changing without explanation. I'm beginning to think we've been set up, Elena said quietly. Not just to kidnap Montgomery's daughter, but to be in exactly this position when all these military vessels arrive. Before Carlos could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. One of Elena's technicians burst onto the bridge with urgent news. Colonel, we've got a problem. The hostage is missing from her containment area. Security cameras show her entering the ventilation system approximately 20 minutes ago. Elena felt her last vestige of control slipping away. Where do the ventilation shafts lead? Engine room, communications center, and weapons storage, the technician replied. The implications were immediately clear. If Vanessa Montgomery reached any of those areas, she could disable the ship's propulsion, contact outside forces directly, or potentially arm herself for a more aggressive escape attempt. Deploy search teams immediately, Elena ordered, and activate emergency lockdown protocols for all critical systems. But as her crew scrambled to implement damage control measures, Elena's communication device rang with a call from the unknown vessel that had been shadowing them for the past hour. Colonel Vasquez, the voice said, this is Commander Sarah Chen of the vessel Harbinger. We represent the actual employers who contracted your services. Elena's blood ran cold. I've been taking orders from Shepard for the past 72 hours. Shepard was a cover identity designed to insulate our organization from direct involvement. We're now moving to direct operational control. Who are you people? We represent interests that believe American infrastructure has become too dependent on private control. Your mission was designed to demonstrate the vulnerability of that system and provide justification for necessary reforms. Elena finally understood the full scope of the manipulation. She and her crew weren't just kidnapping participants. They were expendable assets in a much larger operation, designed to reshape American economic policy through manufactured crisis. What are your orders? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Maintain position until all military vessels arrive. When they attempt to board your ship, resist with lethal force. The resulting confrontation will provide the final justification needed for emergency federal intervention in private infrastructure control. Elena looked out at the approaching ships and realized she was being ordered to start a battle that would likely result in the deaths of her entire crew. The people who had hired her wanted to use their deaths as propaganda for a political agenda they'd never been told about. Deep within the ship's ventilation system, Vanessa had reached the engine room and was working to access the ship's communication array. Her engineering training was proving invaluable as she bypassed security systems that her captors had installed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. She managed to activate an emergency transponder that would broadcast her exact location to any rescue forces in the area. But more importantly, she gained access to the ship's internal communication system. For the first time since her kidnapping, she could hear everything her captors were saying to each other. What she heard made her realize that her rescue was only part of a much larger conspiracy involving federal officials, private military contractors, and foreign interests that wanted to destabilize American economic independence. Her kidnapping had been designed to trigger a crisis that would justify the largest seizure of private assets in American history. As she worked to sabotage the ship's engines and create opportunities for her father's rescue team, Vanessa began planning how to expose the real conspiracy behind her abduction. Saving herself was no longer enough. She needed to save her father's empire and possibly the entire principle of private enterprise in America. The convergence of military vessels was now less than 30 minutes away, and Elena Vasquez was being forced to choose between following orders that would likely result in her death or betraying employers who had manipulated her from the beginning. The real battle was about to begin, and the stakes were much higher than anyone had originally understood. The ocean surface erupted in chaos as Marcus Montgomery's insertion team breached Maria Isabella's hull simultaneously from 3 different points. The operation, executed with military precision, caught Elena Vasquez's crew completely off guard despite their heightened alert status. But what should have been a straightforward rescue quickly evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Lieutenant Jake Morrison led the primary assault team through the ship's cargo hold while 2 secondary teams secured the bridge and engine room. Their intelligence had been perfect. Too perfect, Morrison realized as they encountered minimal resistance from guards who seemed more confused than prepared for combat. Alpha Team to command, Morrison reported through his tactical radio. Initial breach successful, but something's wrong here. The crew isn't fighting back like professionals. They're acting like they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. From his position aboard the Neptune's shadow, Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Professional mercenaries didn't simply abandon their posts during an assault unless they'd been ordered to do so, or unless they were following a script that called for their capture. Dr. Rachel Kim, monitoring communications intercepts, had reached the same conclusion. Marcus, I'm picking up transmissions between the Maria Isabella and that unidentified vessel calling itself the Harbinger. Elena Vasquez is being given real-time instructions on how to respond to the boarding action. The tactical display showed the Harbinger maintaining position just outside the immediate combat zone, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid direct involvement. The USS Baltimore and her sister ship had also arrived but were holding back, apparently under orders to allow the private rescue operation to proceed while maintaining oversight. It's a performance, Marcus realized. They want us to succeed, but they want it to look like we had to fight for it. Meanwhile, Vanessa had reached the ship's communications center through the ventilation system and was working frantically to access the vessel's external communication array. Her engineering background proved invaluable as she bypassed security protocols her captors had never expected an economics graduate to understand. The first transmission she intercepted changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. The conversation was between Commander Sarah Chen of the Harbinger and someone identified only as Director Park, whose voice Vanessa recognized from news broadcasts as Secretary of Homeland Security Jennifer Park. Phase 5 is proceeding as planned, Chen reported. Montgomery's team has boarded the vessel and will secure the hostage within the next 15 minutes. The rescue will appear successful, but the intelligence we plant on the vessel will provide justification for expanded federal oversight. What kind of intelligence? Park's voice asked. Documentation showing that Montgomery Industries has been selling infrastructure access to foreign intelligence services. The evidence will suggest that today's airport disruptions were just a demonstration of capabilities he's been secretly providing to hostile nations. Vanessa felt her blood turn to ice. The conspiracy wasn't just about using her kidnapping to justify infrastructure nationalization. It was about destroying her father's reputation and possibly having him charged with treason. She activated the ship's emergency broadcast system and began transmitting on all frequencies, hoping to reach not just her father but anyone else who might be monitoring the situation. This is Vanessa Montgomery, aboard the Maria Isabella. I am being rescued by my father's team, but this entire operation is a false flag designed to frame Marcus Montgomery for selling infrastructure access to foreign powers. Secretary of Homeland Security Jennifer Park is directly involved in orchestrating this conspiracy. The transmission was cut short when Elena Vasquez burst into the communications center, her sidearm drawn but her expression conflicted rather than hostile. "Ms. Montgomery, step away from the equipment," Elena ordered, but her voice lacked conviction. "You heard the transmission," Vanessa said calmly. "You know what they're planning to do to both of us. Your employers intend to use your deaths as martyrs for their cause, and they're planning to frame my father for crimes he didn't commit." Elena's hand shook as she kept the weapon trained on Vanessa. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation." "I understand that you're being used just like I am," Vanessa replied. "The difference is that I have resources to fight back. Help me, and I can protect you and your crew. Continue following their orders, and you'll all be dead within the hour." The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison and two of his team members. But instead of immediately securing Vanessa, Morrison paused as he assessed the situation. "Ma'am," he said to Vanessa, "we need to evacuate you immediately. But we're picking up concerning intelligence, suggesting this entire operation may be compromised." Elena slowly lowered her weapon. "Your daughter is right, Mr. Morrison. We've all been manipulated into serving someone else's agenda." The decision to trust Elena proved crucial when she provided Morrison with intelligence about the Harbinger's true mission and the evidence that was being planted throughout the Maria Isabella to incriminate Marcus Montgomery. Working together, they began systematically locating and neutralizing the fabricated evidence while preparing for extraction. Hidden throughout the ship were sophisticated intelligence packages designed to look like Marcus Montgomery had been secretly coordinating with foreign operatives. Fake communication logs, forged financial records, and planted encryption devices all pointed to a narrative of systematic infrastructure betrayal. Elena's crew had been unknowingly installing this evidence throughout their journey, believing they were upgrading security systems. "This is incredibly sophisticated," Morrison observed as they discovered a cache of fabricated documents in the ship's safe. "Whoever planned this has been working on it for months, possibly years. They've created an entire parallel history of your father's business operations." Vanessa examined the forged materials with growing horror. The fictional narrative they painted showed Marcus Montgomery as a calculating trader who had been selling American infrastructure vulnerabilities to Chinese and Russian intelligence services for over a decade. The airport disruptions were framed as a demonstration of his capabilities to potential foreign buyers. "The beauty of the frame-up is its plausibility," Elena admitted as she helped them locate more planted evidence. "Your father's legitimate capabilities are being recontextualized as proof of illegitimate activities. Anyone who doesn't know the truth would find this evidence compelling." But their collaboration was interrupted by new developments that none of them had anticipated. The USS Baltimore had moved closer to the Maria Isabella and was demanding immediate surrender of all parties involved in what they termed an illegal private military operation in international waters. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the ship's communication system. "All personnel aboard the Maria Isabella are to surrender immediately. This vessel is being seized as evidence in a federal investigation of infrastructure terrorism and potential treason." Marcus received this transmission aboard his submarine with growing fury. The federal seizure of his rescue operation was clearly the next phase of the conspiracy, designed to paint him as a rogue operator whose private military capabilities posed a threat to national security. Dr. Rachel Kim was frantically analyzing intercepted communications between various federal agencies. "Marcus, they're not just after infrastructure control. Intelligence suggests they're planning to use this incident to justify the creation of a new federal agency with sweeping powers over all private security operations." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer with each intercepted transmission. The Department of Homeland Security had been working with select members of Congress to draft legislation that would effectively federalize all private security companies with capabilities exceeding certain thresholds. Marcus Montgomery's demonstration of private military power during the rescue operation would serve as the justification for this unprecedented expansion of federal authority. "They're essentially trying to eliminate the concept of private military contractors," Rachel explained. "Any company with the resources to mount operations like this would be forced to either disband or be absorbed into federal agencies." The implications extended far beyond Montgomery Industries. Defense contractors, private security firms, and even corporate security departments would all fall under federal control if the legislation passed. The American tradition of private enterprise providing competitive alternatives to government services would effectively end it in the security sector. Marcus made a decision that would either save his empire or destroy it completely. All units prepare for full disclosure protocol. We're going to expose this entire operation in real time. What followed was an unprecedented demonstration of private intelligence capabilities that showcased exactly why the federal government feared independent private operators. Marcus activated communication networks that had been built over decades, bypassing all traditional channels and broadcasting directly to news organizations, social media platforms, and government oversight agencies simultaneously. The evidence package he released was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Recorded conversations between Secretary Park and her co-conspirators revealed the conspiracy's timeline and objectives. Financial records showed how the operation had been funded through black budget allocations hidden within routine Homeland Security appropriations. Most damning of all were the operational plans that detailed exactly how the kidnapping had been orchestrated to trigger Marcus's predictable response. Ladies and gentlemen of the press and the American people, Marcus announced during a live broadcast from his submarine, "What you are witnessing is not the rescue of my daughter from random criminals. This is the exposure of a conspiracy by federal officials to manufacture a crisis that would justify the largest expansion of government power in American history." The revelation created immediate chaos in Washington, as members of Congress who had been kept in the dark about the operation demanded explanations for why a cabinet-level official was involved in what appeared to be a domestic false flag operation. Within hours, emergency hearings were being scheduled and criminal investigations were being launched. But the most dramatic moment came when Elena Vasquez made her own decision to break with her employers. Using Maria Isabella's communication system, she broadcast a detailed confession describing how she and her crew had been manipulated into participating in an operation designed to destabilize American infrastructure independence. "We were hired to kidnap Vanessa Montgomery," she announced on all emergency frequencies. "But we were never told that our real purpose was to provide justification for the largest federal power grab in American history. Secretary of Homeland Security Jennifer Park and her co-conspirators used us as expendable assets in a conspiracy against the American people." Elena's confession included specific details about the recruitment process, the false identity used to hire her services, and the systematic deception that had led her crew to believe they were working for legitimate intelligence interests. She revealed how the operational parameters had been designed to ensure maximum chaos and federal response. "They wanted my crew to die during the rescue operation," she continued. "Our deaths were supposed to provide emotional justification for emergency legislation that had already been drafted and was waiting for the right crisis to justify its passage." The confession was broadcast live on news networks across the country, creating a political earthquake that would reshape American politics for years to come. Secretary Park was forced to resign within hours, and several other federal officials were placed under investigation for their involvement in the conspiracy. The Harbinger, recognizing that their cover had been blown, attempted to flee the area but was intercepted by Navy vessels, whose commanders had received direct orders from the Pentagon to detain all parties involved in the unauthorized operation. The investigation that followed revealed a network of federal officials and private contractors who had been working to systematically expand government control over various sectors of the American economy. The rescue operation concluded with Vanessa's safe return to her father's submarine, but the real victory was the exposure of a conspiracy that could have fundamentally altered the balance of power between private enterprise and federal authority in America. As Neptune's shadow surfaced in international waters, Marcus Montgomery found himself in the unexpected position of having saved not just his daughter, but the principle of private enterprise itself. The airport disruptions that had seemed so damaging to his reputation were now understood as a desperate father's response to a manufactured crisis, rather than evidence of dangerous private power. The public response to the revelations was swift and decisive. Congressional investigations led to criminal charges against multiple federal officials. The legislation that would have federalized private security operations was not only defeated but replaced with new protections for private enterprise rights. Public opinion, initially skeptical of Marcus Montgomery's extreme response to his daughter's kidnapping, shifted dramatically once the true nature of the conspiracy became clear. Elena Vasquez and her crew were granted immunity in exchange for their testimony against the real conspirators. Her decision to break with her employers and expose the truth had transformed her from a criminal into a whistleblower whose information proved crucial in unraveling the broader conspiracy that extended into multiple federal agencies and private defense contractors. 6 months later, Vanessa Montgomery would testify before Congress about her experience helping to draft new legislation that protected private infrastructure ownership while establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. Her kidnapping had inadvertently strengthened the very system it was designed to destroy. Marcus Montgomery's empire not only survived the crisis but emerged stronger than ever, with federal contracts to help secure the infrastructure systems he had temporarily disrupted. The demonstration of his capabilities during the crisis had proven that private enterprise could respond to threats more quickly and effectively than traditional government agencies, leading to a new model of public-private cooperation in national security. The conspiracy's failure represented more than just a victory for one family. It established that American innovation and private enterprise could not be destroyed through manufactured crises and political manipulation. The attempt to use Vanessa's kidnapping as justification for expanded federal power had instead demonstrated the vital importance of maintaining the balance between private capability and public oversight that had made America prosperous. The broader implications of the case extended into international relations as well. The exposure of how domestic officials had been willing to manufacture crises for political gain damaged American credibility in global forums where the United States had traditionally criticized other nations for similar tactics. However, the swift justice delivered to the conspirators and the transparency of the investigation helped restore confidence in American institutions. As father and daughter stood on the deck of the submarine watching the sunrise over the Caribbean, they both understood that their ordeal had revealed something important about the resilience of American institutions and the ingenuity of American entrepreneurs. The forces that had tried to destroy them had only made them stronger, and the precedent they had set would protect other private enterprises from similar attacks in the future. The war that had begun with a simple kidnapping had ended with the preservation of economic freedom itself, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected battles, and that the price of liberty truly is eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice freedom for the illusion of security. In the years that followed, the Montgomery case would become required study material at business schools and military academies alike, analyzed as a masterclass in crisis management and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. Vanessa herself would go on to establish the Montgomery Institute for Private Enterprise Security, a think tank dedicated to protecting American businesses from similar government overreach. The submarine Neptune's shadow was eventually donated to the Smithsonian, where it became a symbol of American ingenuity and the lengths to which free citizens would go to protect their constitutional rights. Visitors from around the world would tour the vessel, marveling at how a private citizen had managed to construct capabilities that rivaled those of small nations. Elena Vasquez founded a consulting firm that specialized in helping companies identify and resist manipulation by hostile actors, whether foreign or domestic. Her unique perspective as both perpetrator and victim of the conspiracy made her one of the most sought-after security advisors in the corporate world. Marcus Montgomery's famous quote from his congressional testimony, "A free market isn't just about profit, it's about the freedom to protect what you've built," would be carved into the entrance of the new Department of Commerce building, serving as a permanent reminder that American prosperity depended on maintaining the delicate balance between innovation and oversight. The Caribbean sunrise that morning had marked not just the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter in American enterprise, one where the lessons learned from the Montgomery kidnapping would ensure that economic freedom remained protected for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.